Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Guust Nieuwenhuis. I hope I'm saying your name right there. It sounds pretty Belgium to me. And we're going to be talking about continuous integration in ColdFusion with Bitbucket Pipelines. And Guust is doing a talk at CF Camp on plumbing with Bitbucket Pipelines. So we're going to look at what those are and why all ColdFusion developers might want to have a look at those, and why doing continuous integration and continuous development are a good thing, what he likes about the Bitbucket repository, and we'll also look at how it integrates with Docker containers and how you can use it on your team. So welcome, Guust.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And if you don't know Guust, he has been a ColdFusion developer for a while. He's a full stack developer, and he's currently developing his own product, Pedrillo, which is a SaaS solution for music. And that's one of his hobbies. He plays the double bass and the drums. So very talented man.
Thank you.
So for those who haven't come across it, first of all, what is Bitbucket? And then what is Bitbucket Pipelines?
Well, before we answer what is Bitbucket, maybe we should even answer what is Git and what is what are code repositories. Basically, for those who haven't heard about it, the last few years, code repositories are a central place where you can host your teams or your individual code base for a project. And one of those solutions for doing that is Git. Git's been very popular last couple of years, and a lot of people are using it very actively. There are a couple of cloud-based solutions for Git servers, and one of them, a very well-known one, is Github. But the other one, you could say, is Bitbucket. Bitbucket is a cloud Git repository by Atlassian. So that's what Bitbucket is, a cloud solution to host your Git repositories, your project's code base, actually. And then pipelines, I guess. Well, what's Bitbucket Pipelines? Well, Bitbucket Pipelines is one of the features on top of Bitbucket, which allows for continuous integration and continuous deployment directly on your Git repository. Let's say that continuous integration and continuous deployment has been around for a while already, but in the past, the solutions for that were in general separate products. There are a couple of well-known ones, definitely in the Java world, for Jenkins, for example. Atlassian has its own standalone product, Bamboo. But nowadays, they've created a very cool implementation directly on top of Bitbucket, directly on top of your Git repository, and that's it's pretty cool to work with, to use, and easy. That's the most important part.
Well, yeah, tell us a bit more about that, and we'll talk a bit more about what continuous integration is later in the episode. But
okay,
why do you, as a ColdFusion developer, why do you like using pipelines for doing your continuous integration?
Well, any conference or any meetup or any meeting or gathering of CF developers over the last couple of years, continuous deployment and continuous integration were hot topics. But well, I have various kind of projects I work for big clients, big projects, smaller stuff that I handle on my own. But what I've noticed in general is that if you have like these big projects, as a developer in a team, I'm not always directly involved in the deployment and integration and everything. So I haven't really touched it on that level. And a lot of the time, I wanted to start using those techniques for my own projects. But it's a pretty big investment mainly time-wise, to get started with setting up your own server, maintaining your own server, keeping track of it, and getting familiar with it. So that's why I never really picked it up for my own projects. But it's with Bitbucket Pipelines, the fact that it's really easy to use, and it's directly on top of your Bitbucket repository. That combination made it an ideal first step for me to like actively start using those techniques for my own project, even very, very small projects. I think one of the first projects I started using it for was a simple static website. Nothing special about it, but it allowed me to run a couple of tests on it, make sure that everything works, bundle it nicely, and immediately deploy it. And all of that done straight out of my Git repository. And one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons why we have Bitbucket pipelines nowadays, and why it didn't exist earlier, is because it's really leveraging the evolution we had with containerization recently, and so which means that it's strongly depending on the Docker stack, and that's a really cool feature, because it allows you to, whatever language, or whatever language or environment you're working with, if it's Cold Fusion or front-end development or Python, Ruby on Rails, .NET, Java, doesn't matter. You can basically, you pick a container, you start building your pipeline on top of a container, and you can really leverage all the areas, all the container offers you right away. And that's really powerful.
Yeah, Docker containers are something that Cold Fusion developers have been using more in the last year or so. And I know Altis just did a whole month of webinars on Docker containers. So it's really, so we'll put a link to those webinars in the show notes for people interested in that. Mm-hmm. Some really cool stuff there. So tell us a bit more about what continuous integration is and why you like doing it, because not everyone listening may be doing it or even understand quite what it is. So.
Mm-hmm. The whole concept is to make sure that you automate part of your workflow, and definitely everything that happens after you've developed and written your code. So if you're working with a lot of tests, if you're working with a test-driven development cycle, then especially at that point, you want to make sure that you run your tests, you automate the process of you running your tests on every time you change your code. And you can definitely do that locally, manually, or have something watch your files and run it. But even better is if you can just, like, when you wrap up something. And that's why it works so closely together with your Git repository. When you push a commit to your repository, that's the ideal time to make sure you run those tests again and check if everything is right, it's working fine. So that's a really, really important step, and something we see less in the Cold Fusion world, but we see a lot nowadays in the front-end world, is where you have to really build your project, make sure you have your dependencies when you're working with front-end frameworks, if you pull in libraries, if you're using NPM, for example, to pull in those projects, open source projects you're using. You want to make sure that you build that correctly as well. You compile your less or your SAS style sheets. You make sure that you minimize and optimize your JavaScript, and all of that can be handled as well in that continuous integration and continuous deployment flow, even up to the point where you can even automate the deployment itself. Make sure that when you have an update ready, that it's immediately deployed on your test server, so you don't have to take care of that. You don't have to do those actions manually anymore. And it's definitely something you can really get an advantage from if you're working by yourself on your own projects, but even more if you're working in team. Make sure that your code is tested, and when you have a pull request ready, that it's tested and that it's validated that way before it's integrated into your code.
So it really automates all the steps you might have done manually of testing the code and sending it to a staging server and any other things that need to happen.
Yeah.
And so that's continuous integration, but is continuous deployment something slightly different?
No, it's the next step. After you do the integration, you do the deployment, and that's something that you can automate as well. What we see, and what of course doesn't work for every environment, but what we see a lot of companies do nowadays is like make really small changes and immediately even release them on production. Like that, they go through cycles, of course, of testing and validation, but to work with very small batches of changes and to have a continuous flow of deployment. And if you want to do that, you need to automate, or you have a full office of DevOps guys who are constantly pushing the buttons to make sure something deploys. If you take it into the extreme, you have the example of Amazon, of course. Who I think they're releasing every second, or maybe like five times a second on average. So that gives an idea of how far you can go, but it all depends on your project, your case, your team, of course. But automating that flow is really interesting.
What kind of problems does it avoid by automating it?
I wouldn't say so much it's avoiding problems. It's much more like smooth. It's a smoother workflow, let's say. So it makes it easier to have the whole movement towards production release.
Mm-hmm.
More than it's solving problems.
Okay. I just wondered if sometimes, people, when they do it manually, they forget to move a file over.
Oh yeah, of course. If we're going back to, if we're looking back at like copy and paste with an FTP server, definitely this automating is much more error safe. But like comparing it to a deployment which is already automated, but like maybe not happening automatically, then it's much more of a comfort thing to have it all done automatically.
So you're basing all this on, it all runs on Bitbucket as the repository. So what do you like about Bitbucket as opposed to, say, GitHub or some other repository that you might use?
Well, they're all Git repositories. So on that level, there isn't much difference. One of the reasons I use GitHub for a lot of stuff, mainly for open source repositories, stuff that I've developed and I've released open source or helping out on other projects. What you see is that, GitHub was the first big one out there. So a lot of open source is hosted on there. So for visibility as well, it's really interesting to host your open source projects on there. The reason why I, in the past, started working with Bitbucket nice to it, well, you mentioned earlier that my name sounds Belgian. It's actually Dutch.
Oh.
And I'm Dutch. The reason why I started working with Bitbucket is because at the time and still today, they allow for private repositories on their free plan as well. They have a slightly different business plan where GitHub is more about the amount of repositories you get. You get on both. You get unlimited public repositories, but with GitHub, you're more like limited in the amount of private ones based on what you're paying. While Bitbucket is much more the whole Atlassian idea of how many users are using it. So the reason why at the time I started using Bitbucket for a couple of private projects is purely that. But nowadays, if I may choose, Bitbucket has a couple of really cool features. With one of them being the whole pipelines, and that's a really nice like solution on top of your repository. So that's definitely why I like working with Bitbucket. So yeah, they by the way, this is really recent. They a couple of weeks ago they activated, well, Atlassian bought Trello, the very famous and well-known project management tool, and they integrated it with Bitbucket as well. So on top of your Git repository, you do not only have Bitbucket pipelines, but you have like a Trello board as well. You have an issue tracker, and you have a lot of functionality all around your repository to make it all easier. So have everything in one place.
Well, is the issue tracker Jira or something else?
It's similar. You can integrate it with Jira, of course, but what you get out of the box and for free is not the full-blown Jira, of course.
Okay, so it's like a cut-down version.
Yeah.
And then, do they provide support for it, or how?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. They have very good documentation, and that solved all of my issues, that's for sure. When I started playing with Bitbucket pipelines at the time, it was still an alpha. So there wasn't that much information around, but it's pretty easy to use. And most of the issues I had with it were not so much Bitbucket pipelines, but more how do you automate your workflow, your process. So that's for sure. I'm pretty sure they have support options, but I haven't had the need for them yet, so I don't know any of the details.
Right. And then is it free, or there's a paid version, or how does that work?
The way it works, so you can have a free Bitbucket account, which So first of all, you have Bitbucket, the Git cloud solution, which has a couple of plans, which mainly around how many users are using your repository. The way pipelines as an add-on is built is that you get it's all about minutes. How many minutes are you building stuff on top of the pipelines? So they're actually running off your pipes. You get a couple of them. You get a couple of minutes per month for free, and then if you want to use more, you just you have two options: or you start paying more for your Bitbucket account, or you buy additional minutes separate from your package you already have with Bitbucket.
But it's how much is it to buy more minutes?
I should have to look it up.
Or do you, I mean, let's ask this question another way. For the projects you do you end up having to pay for this? Let me ask the question another way. You run several projects through this. Do you end up having to pay much for it, or?
Well, what I notice in general, it all depends on how active your project is developed. If you're working with multiple developers at the same time, all doing like small pushes to the repository, and then your builds are running quite frequently. So then it might go pretty quick. But if it's in my opinion, it's really nice. It has a nice balance in the way that if you're working by yourself alone on a project, the minutes you get per month, those will get you pretty far. If you're working with a bigger team, of course, then you'll probably have to buy some extra minutes. And another thing as well is that what I noticed personally is that when you're setting up your pipeline, at the beginning, you do quite some testing, make sure that everything is tweaked and working correctly. That's a period in which you're using quite some minutes as well to make sure that everything runs smooth. There is a way to avoid this a little. They have a way you can actually test and build your pipelines locally on your local machine with Docker containers. But I must be very honest, I've never looked into that and just did it right on the repository, build it along with my code base.
And, I looked at their pricing page on their website, and we'll put that in the show notes, but you can have several users. It looks like 5 users on there for free, at that starter level. Or if you need to go beyond that, it's $2 a user a month. And if you need extra minutes, you can get 1,000 build minutes for $10. So it doesn't look like it's particularly expensive to...
No, and that's something I really like as well.
Cool.
Which makes it really, and what I said at the beginning, where in the past the solutions, you actually had to set up your own servers and spend a lot of time and money as well to get it up and running. For me, the way you get continuous integration and continuous development with the Bitbucket pipelines makes it available for the masses, for small developers all around, freelancers, smaller teams, or even people coding for fun.
So when you're doing this integration, you're using Docker containers. Where are you running those? Are they on an Amazon cloud or somewhere else? Or? So
the containers for the integration, the containers used by Bitbucket pipelines, Bitbucket takes care of it. So you don't have to do anything for that. You don't have to host it anywhere. You don't have to run it anywhere. But next to that, I used Docker containers a lot on my projects, and that's fair. I have both some VPS servers where I run some containers on as well as some AWS infrastructure. The way Bitbucket had built it, pipelines, is that the whole infrastructure for pipelines is running on top of AWS as well.
Okay.
On top of AWS.
Okay, so it's easy to integrate in with that if you want to.
Yeah, but
you can really use any cloud deployment that you want to.
You can use any cloud deployment you want to do the initial the deployment. You're not even obliged to use Docker containers for it. The cool thing about Bitbucket pipelines is that it's using Docker containers itself, and that makes it really, really flexible. But there is a nice integration as well with the whole container concept, which makes it possible within your pipelines to create those containers and to then automatically deploy them as well.
And have you used this with teams as well as yourself, or
mainly by myself?
Okay.
Most of the teams. There was one team last year. They would have probably gone for Bitbucket pipelines, but at the time they started the project, it wasn't available yet. So they had just set up their Jenkins servers. So they saw the value of it. They didn't switch anymore because the whole thing was set up. The moment you have your setup, you just maintain it, and it's a big investment if you want to change it afterwards, especially with a big project as the one I'm talking about.
Right.
So I'm in general, the vast majority of use cases I have is with personal projects, small clients, stuff I'm working on my own.
What's the advantage then of if you did use it on a team?
Definitely the fact, when I'm working by myself on projects, it's if an integration or a deployment needs to be done, it'll be me all the time. So I know what I'm doing and how I have to do it. If you're working in a team, then immediately, if you want everyone to be able to do it, then you need to train everyone. Everyone needs to make sure they know what they're doing, and so on. So by automating all of that, the need for that goes away. If the fact that you can run the integration with the tests and everything, make sure that everybody's code is tested before it gets introduced in the code base, and it's like a code security layer you can add. Of course, when we're talking about, and this is more the case with front-end development, for example, if you're looking at code formatting, linters, stuff like that, you can run all of that as well during your integration to make sure that everything is really nice and smooth before it enters the code base for serious.
So it lets your team be more efficient.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned you use it with Docker containers. I noticed on their website it also integrates with Docker Hub. So
yeah, let me explain that a little, because there are two things. If you look at Bitbucket Pipelines and Docker, there are two things. One of them being that you can actually build your Docker containers and have them ready to be used, like register them and automate your deployment of it as well. But the other thing is that every pipeline you make starts on top of a container. And to give an example of that, if you have an AngularJS, or React, or an Ember project, which is pure JavaScript frontend code, then you would start your pipeline you would build it on top of an Node.js container. You just use a standard Node.js container, and what that gives you is that Node and NPM are out of the box installed, so you don't have to take care of the installation of Node and NPM anymore during your pipeline. You can immediately run npm install, which installs all the dependencies, and build on top of that to run your tests, your build scripts, and everything. If you have a Java project, for example, you start building on top of a container which leverages Java already, and you can start, like, you don't have to take care of that anymore. I have a couple of projects where I work a little with Python for like some scripting and stuff. And there I just take a container which is Java, so I immediately have the package manager for Java installed. That goes really smooth. The same exists for ColdFusion as well. One of the things I've been playing with last week, and a couple of other people in the community have done the same thing already as well, is to use a command box Docker container as the starting point for your Bitbucket pipeline, which immediately makes the whole box environment available, which allowed me to do a simple, like an installation of ColdBox, installation of TestBox, run my tests, and all of that on top of the built-in server that you have with command box. And otherwise, if you want to do that, run those ColdFusion tests, for example, you would use a container which leverages ColdFusion without ColdBox, or without command box. You could do that as well, of course, but you have to make sure you have that container. There is the official Lucy container, of course, but for Adobe ColdFusion, for example, it's currently it's on their roadmap, but it's not available yet. And that makes it really easy. There are even a couple of cases where I haven't done it yet. I've done it in the past, but I haven't done it on any current project. Is where I would build my own container and use that, and that's another thing you could definitely do, and make sure that, but it all ends up in faster pipelines. An example for that is if you would pick start off a Python container, and you want to use the AWS CLI to make sure that you can do a deployment really easily. What I should definitely do myself one of the next weeks is actually make myself a Docker container, which is built on top of Python and has the CLI installed by default. Of course, I'm then responsible myself to maintain that container for my deployments. But that does mean that every single pipeline which is running, which is using the AWS CLI, I don't have to install it anymore, which makes my builds go faster, which is cool because then I have a quicker result and quicker feedback. But it also makes it less expensive for me to run those pipelines because they consume less time.
And then if you're using this with a team, do all their builds go in a queue and you have to wait, or is it all happening at the same time?
Bitbucket manages the load with a queue. So from time to time, I have a build which is like in a queue. It's like waiting to get some processing power. But in general, that has always been less than like a minute or two. Most of the time, I immediately get the computing power, and the build runs immediately. And also maybe something I definitely need to explain is that those builds are triggered by your commits, your pushes to your Git repository. So when I do a code change, I make a commit. The moment I push the commit to Bitbucket, that's when it immediately triggers the build to happen, which is something with other tools like Jenkins and Bamboo and so on, is something you need to configure and configure yourself to happen.
And so you commit your changes, and it goes ahead and tests it and deploys it. How do you get feedback as to whether the tests ran okay?
That depends how you want it. You can go to the interface and you can visually see it. You actually get the whole output of everything that happens. You have a view of that. The way I have it configured is I've integrated Slack with a couple of my repositories so that I get a notification when a build starts, when a build fails, and when it's succeeded. And I always have configured that the moment a build fails, I get an email. I still use email for a lot of stuff, and even notifications, which isn't always ideal. I know, but it's something I've always opened, so that way I get some immediate feedback.
Cool. And then, when you're building this pipeline, are you writing some kind of scripting language, or how do you create the pipeline?
It's a YAML configuration file, which is basically it's some kind of coding style, where you actually define your container, and then you can explain, like, list all the different steps. What I've done in a couple of cases is that I list every single step along the way. The moment that my pipelines get bigger, I tend to just put everything in a batch script and execute the batch script for my pipeline, which makes it a little easier to maintain because you keep your configuration a bit smaller.
Cool. Okay.
One of the cool things as well is that you can configure your pipeline based on your branch. So what I personally always do in Git is that I have the master branch. I always work with a develop branch and feature branches for the different features I work on. And then in my configuration file for my pipeline, I have the standard steps, which are executed on every single branch. But I have a specific configuration for my develop branch and a specific configuration for my master branch, where in some cases the develop branch will automatically deploy on the test environment or on the acceptance environment, where the master branch would deploy on the production environment. And then the feature branches, they always run the tests, make sure that everything works fine. Maybe make a build to make sure that that's working fine, but I don't do any deployment of those. But the moment a feature is ready, I merge the branch into develop. There it gets tested again, it gets built again, and it gets deployed automatically. And the moment I want to release to production, I just merge my develop branch into my master branch, and it's all done.
Cool. Anything else you want to share with our listeners about Bitbucket pipelines?
Let me quickly think if there are any of the features. I shouldn't tell everything, because
No,
otherwise
so
people in 2 weeks won't come to my session anymore at CF Camp. But a really cool feature, which is currently in alpha, you can ask for alpha access, and I don't think they're giving it away if you just ask for it. I got it that way anyway. One of the cool features in alpha currently is that you can actually split your build up in steps, which is easy for organization to have, like a testing step and then a building step and then a deployment step. But the really cool thing is you can actually select a different container to be used for those different steps, which means that for an Ember.js project, for example, you can build your test step on top of a Node.js container. You do the same with your build step. You build everything on top of a Node.js container. But then for your deployment step, you could actually use a Python container where you use Amazon CLI, AWS CLI to deploy your finished product straight onto an S3 account, for example, or anything else. So that's really cool. You're basically every single command you're executing is just like a command, the identical type to the way you would do it in a terminal. So anything you can do in a terminal, and you can do in your pipeline. So cool. I have cases where I do S3 deployments, where I have a static site, and I just, once it's been built, I take everything and I wipe out an S3 bucket and put everything, the whole build in there, and then let AWS know it needs to refresh its cache, and then my build is done. I have other cases where I also deploy well, not really deploy, but I use S3 as like an artifactory to put a zip of my build, and so that's they're all listed over there. I can pull it. I have separate deployment scripts for which are not integrated in pipelines because the servers aren't integrated.
So if someone listening was curious to get started with Bitbucket Pipelines, how would you recommend someone get started with it?
Well, open your Bitbucket account, or create one if you haven't. And go to your repository, and on the left in the menu you'll notice Bitbucket. You'll notice pipelines. If you click on it, it already has a small introduction, and you can, if you activate it on your repository, it immediately helps you out defining the base of your pipeline, and then start playing with it. Look around the documentation. There are tons of examples in the documentation how to integrate with AWS, how to integrate with Slack, for example. It's all described in the documentation, so it's just it's easy.
Okay, and so, roughly how long does it take to get up to speed with this?
It all depends how complex your pipeline is.
Let's say a simple pipeline just to get started.
If you have a front-end project where you just want to run your tests every time you do a commit, that'll take you half an hour to get started or something.
Oh, okay.
You just follow the starter, the wizard on your Bitbucket account, and if you take Node as your container, it'll immediately suggest to do like an npm install, npm test, and you're done. It goes really easy. It gets a little more complex once you need to integrate with third-party stuff, with AWS. If you need, when you need to like install the CLI, make sure you know what to do in the CLI, but that's much more. Those are much more difficulties around the characteristics of AWS than around Bitbucket.
Cool. Well, this is good. Let's change gears a little and talk a bit about ColdFusion, if that's okay. So tell us why you're proud to use ColdFusion, Guust.
Because it solves every problem which is thrown at me. I think that's the most important thing. It's super flexible, and I can do anything I want with it. Of course, there are cases where other technologies or other solutions are more appropriate, but it got me started. It started my career, and I've been able to do everything I needed to do until now. So there's. We all know the situation with Cold Fusion. It's not the most popular language. So I always keep an eye out on what else is there, but I haven't really ran into anything which is that easy to me to use. So I still love it, and I'm not walking away from it. So.
Great. Yeah, I mean, some people have said Cold Fusion is dying, but I think, as the title of this podcast, Cold Fusion Alive, I think it's actually alive. But let me ask you, what would it...
Every language is dying if you look at it. The only stuff which is popular nowadays are like some of the new cool things. And in general, a lot of the innovation is happening on the front end, anyways. On the back end, it's all business as usual. But Cold Fusion still does it, and there's still several mainframes running on COBOL. So even that doesn't go away. So
yeah, maybe programming languages never go away.
No, they never go away. There's always somebody who has use for it, so that's for sure.
But let me ask you, what would it take for Cold Fusion to be even more alive this year?
Oh, good question. I think adopting modern techniques is the most important thing. I think that for a certain period of time, that's something which hasn't really happened within the Cold Fusion environment, not in the community, not with the vendors, and that gave us a little, we're a little behind on a couple of things. But if you look at what happened the last couple of years with the command box as a CLI tool, with the whole box ecosystem as a very, very enterprise framework to work with. The Lucy containers, the fact that Adobe is working on Cold Fusion Docker containers, that's something that needs to happen. And we need to make sure that that we catch up and we stay modern with those techniques. Look into ways how we can make sure that Cold Fusion is ready for the modern architectures of software development, and prove that it's capable of working in those situations and in those situations as well. I think that's the focus should lie there.
Great. Well, it makes sense to me. So what are you looking forward to at CF Camp this year?
The first thing that popped in mind was the beer.
Well, yes, it is in Munich. That is true. In October, which could mean there could be some Oktoberfest going on.
Unfortunately, the Oktoberfest actually happens in September.
Oh,
so
okay.
That's all over.
Had me fooled there.
Yeah. I thought the first time I went to Munich for CF Camp, I was like, October. Well, yeah. No. It's for me. First of all, it's meeting people. It's in Europe. It's the meeting place to meet people from other countries that are working with Cold Fusion, to see some familiar faces again. There are people, several people I meet over there are people I only see once a year at CF Camp. So catching up is a really cool thing. But the content this year looks really promising as well. A nice balance between the different subjects. So I'm definitely looking forward to make sure that I attend as much other sessions as possible. I tend to always skip the one before my session and after.
Yes.
The one before because I'm stressing out, and the one after because I'm decompressing and running towards beer. If my
Yes.
session is in the afternoon, as it is this year. So yeah, it's and it's a very nice location, and I'm specifically looking forward to the fact that it's sold out this year.
Right.
It's been announced a couple of hours ago. It's sold out for the first time in history. So it's going to be the largest crowd ever. So you see, Cold Fusion isn't dying. Certainly not in Europe.
That is great. So if people want to find you online, what's the best way to do that?
I have a Twitter account, which is at Lagaffe, Lagaffe. That in general is my nickname around the web. I have a website, guustnieuwenhuis.be, where you can find links towards all my social media accounts and so on. So you can follow me all around the web that way. And I'm in the CFML Slack channel, of course. Not always super active. I'm pretty busy recently with a lot of work. So, but whenever you want to reach out to me, make sure you just tag my name somewhere in a channel or send me a direct message, and it'll become a notification on my computer and on my phone and on my tablet. So if I'm ignoring you at that point, then something in private life is more important. But otherwise, I should be
Yes,
reacting pretty quick.
Maybe you're out at the orchestra or playing on your bass.
Indeed, making some music.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and good luck with your talk. And
thank you.
Hope to see you another time.
Cool, for sure.
Okay, tot ziens.
Bye bye.